Hello. So today we are back with Partha Chatterjee and looking at his book Politics of the Governed, largely trying to understand what does popular democratic politics look like in the post-colonial world. This is also in a continuation of our understanding of governmentality from Michel Foucault, where he looks at techniques of government and how they shape subjects. But in the post-colonial world, techniques of governmentality predate the emergence of sovereignty or the existence of right-bearing citizens. So in those contexts, what happens? What function does governmentality serve, apart from its stated aim of enumerating, describing, and disciplining inhabitants? But apart from that, what imaginations does it unfold? What domains of popular politics does it foster and let happen? So that's the topic of today's lecture. Today's lecture is based on Partha Chatterjee's book, The Politics of the Governed, but I've also put up two other texts, related texts, Lineages of Political Society, and I Am the People, Reflections on Popular Sovereignty Today. And in my understanding, Partha Chatterjee's work is an unfolding of the understanding of democratic politics and subaltern politics in the Indian subcontinent. The work that he begins with his understanding and conceptualization of national imaginations, going on to his understanding of politics of the governed. So we spoke about national imaginations in our previous class, and today we are looking at popular politics. Now, he also wants us to remember that the idea of popular sovereignty by the middle of the 20th century becomes so naturalized that any form of government, it could be democratic, it could be dictatorial, was in the name of popular sovereignty, was ruling in the name of people. So this idea becomes very normal for us, the idea that a government's task is to rule for the people and in the interest of the people. So that's the idea of popular sovereignty that he traces through in the post-colonial world. Now, in the Indian subcontinent and in a large part of the colonial world, techniques of governmentality, of enumeration, of describing populations, of classifications, of categorizations, all of that emerge before the state or the nation has claimed its sovereignty, before the inhabitants are rights-bearing citizens. So Partha Chatterjee asks, what does politics look like when most people are governed, not represented, when governmentality is the domain through which the state and the people connect, not necessarily the people connecting with the state as rights-bearing citizens, as in the understanding of liberal democracy. Now, this understanding that gets shaped in the colonial world carries on to the post-colonial world, and this, he says, is quite different in the way democratic politics works in India and the rest of the post-colonial world than how it functions in Europe and the United States. Through this project, and I spoke about this in the previous lecture, Partha Chatterjee, along with others from the Subaltern Studies Collective, have tried to reshape and relook at several taken for granted concepts of social theory. Now, basically, theory is abstract, and abstract theory largely pretends a certain generalizable sense or quality. It also has a universalist claim. But then when you take it, so if it is universalist, it should be able to work in many contexts. So he takes it and scrutinizes it in the post-colonial world, in the Indian, specifically Bengali context, and sees that those theories need to be reworked, and therefore he does them. And so in the beginning of the book, he articulates that through my lenses, through the studies that I have done, through looking at these particular historical contexts, very central ideas of social theory such as civil society, citizenship appear very different. So let's see how they appear very different. Civil society, usually understood as the characteristic institutions of modern associational life originating in Western societies but then spreading elsewhere, that are based on equality, autonomy, freedom of entry and exit, contract, deliberative procedures of decision making, recognized rights and duties of members, and other principles. This is the standard, widely accepted understanding of civil society. But through Partha Chatterjee's lenses, it appears as the closed association of modern elite groups sequestered from the wider popular life of communities, walled up between enclaves of freedom and rational law. He's also drawing on Gramsci's understanding over here, but situating it in the Indian context. Citizenship, he says, takes up two different forms. There is the formal, that is the idea of equal citizens that can claim rights from the state, and the real. In the real, it's kind of fuzzy, and you'll see how when we go into our understanding of how democratic politics works on the ground. He said, instead of talking about the ruler and the ruled, we need to kind of reframe this discussion and think of those who govern and those who are governed. That's why the title of the book, Politics of the Governed. Governance, this is fairly straightforward, is the body of knowledge and set of techniques used by or on behalf of those who govern. Democracy, he says, is not the government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Rather, he says, it should be understood as the politics of the governed. This is one of the significant moves theoretically that he is making in this book. He's widening the spectrum of what counts as democratic politics and what counts as politics itself by making visible those areas which didn't necessarily fit into our understanding of citizen, state, liberal politics. So in order to arrive at this understanding, he goes back to Benedict Anderson, and this time he looks at the next book after Imagined Communities, titled The Spectre of Comparisons. In The Spectre of Comparisons, Anderson talks about two serialities. One is the unbound seriality and one is bound serialities. Here he is speaking about homogeneous time of modernity, of the nation. Remember, we spoke about how everybody reading the newspaper collectively, not collectively, in their own spaces, but at the same time creates a certain synchronicity and a certain imagination where individuals can then imagine themselves to be part of a collective that is not a face-to-face collective where most members wouldn't necessarily or ever know each other. Now, nationalism or nations were for the most part seen as one of the greatest inventions, as something that through the French Revolution, through the American Revolution, brought modernity into the world. Ideas of liberty, fraternity, equality, all of that come with this understanding, and including actually post-colonial nationalisms and the struggle for freedom and the quest towards this liberty, equality, fraternity were seen in a positive light. Once larger ethnic conflicts, conflicts based on national identification, all of them begin to proliferate. The term nationalism acquired a somewhat negative connotation. Now, Chatterjee argues that Anderson is articulating the unbound serialities and bound serialities in order to distinguish between the good part of nationalism and that which can be associated or is usually associated with ethnic conflict. So the unbound serialities are what Anderson talks about as the classical instruments of national imagination, such as the newspaper and the novel. And because these enable the individual to transcend the traditional confines of community and imagine a larger, broader, wider community, these can be potentially liberating. This is the good nationalism. On the other hand, the bound serialities operates only with integers, right? This is the domain of governmentality where you are a statistic. You can either be 1 or 0. it cannot be a fraction. One can't be in statistics, in this kind of enumeration or this bound seriality. It is not possible to be, well, I'm partially atheist and partially Hindu and partially have like, so it's very, like, it doesn't allow for this kind of contingent, partial belongings. And by being fixed, by being rigid, it is constricting, and Anderson argues that this perhaps is possibly conflictual and offers the tools for ethnic conflicts, because once people start imagining themselves as either 0 or 1, these boundaries become very sharp and can potentially create conflict. In this understanding, the idea is that tradition is necessarily pre-modern. Tradition is, it in fact creates a binary between tradition and modernity, and it situates nations and nation states in a kind of linear hierarchical model, where if you are still confined by ethnic communities, by traditional norms, and haven't transcended them, then you are somehow behind. And then this gets mapped onto the world map, where some countries are seen as advanced in the sense of their national identity and state being in the unbound serialities domain, whereas others are seen as still trapped and in the quest to make up. I should also mention, we talked about Doreen Massey and how she speaks about space as, as somehow acquiring this temporality, as some places seen as forever backward in the race towards modernity, whereas some places seen as ahead. So spatiality and temporality kind of come together in this particular hierarchy. Well, Chatterjee and Massey both have different projects, but very with overlaps, but in one could argue that they are making a similar point about how modernity kind of situates spaces on the globe in a temporally sequenced, hierarchically bound way of forward and backward, ahead and back, advanced and developing or developed, and so on. So Partha Chatterjee writes, time in this conception, in the way Anderson situates it, easily translates into space. Politics in this sense inhabits the homogeneous time space. So he doesn't just take time from Anderson, he insists on placing the space there, homogeneous time space of modernity, right? As if this idea, this modular idea will very seamlessly travel. This is also, this time space of modernity is also the time space of capital. I mean, in fact, capital, the way it sees, if it comes upon an impediment, it usually sees that as something that is pre-modern and then basically needs to catch up. Now, this logic Partha Chatterjee negates, and he says that he disagrees with. In fact, on studying on the ground popular real world politics, politics in practice, Partha Chatterjee theorizes and writes, people can only imagine themselves in empty homogeneous time. They do not live in it. Empty homogeneous time is the utopian time of capital. It linearly connects past, present and future, creating the possibility of, for all of those historicist imaginings of identity, nationhood, progress and so on that Anderson along with others have made familiar to us. But empty homogeneous time is not located anywhere in the real space, it is utopian. The real space of modern life consists of heterotopia, a term that he borrows from Michel Foucault. Time here is heterogeneous, unevenly dense. Here even industrial workers do not all internalize the work discipline of capitalism, and more curiously, even when they do not do so in the same way. Politics here does not mean the same thing to all people. In fact, he gives many examples of the businessman waiting to sign the deal for the appropriate date or time that his astrologer has predicted or asked him to do so, or workers waiting to start working on a machine so that all the required rituals can be completed. This, he says, is heterogeneous time. It is not homogeneous time in the way Anderson conceptualizes it. So, homogeneous time is a utopian time. It doesn't exist in real space, whereas heterogeneous time is the world of popular politics, of real politics. Homogeneous time pretends a certain universalism, whereas heterogeneous time is historical, contingent, particular. Homogeneous time, we already spoke about, is the time of capital, whereas heterogeneous time, Partha Chatterjee says, is the time of governmentality, where techniques of government must come face to face with the messiness of the classifications, categorizations of the kind of associations that develop in democratic politics and the negotiations that unfold in these techniques of governmentality. One is the homogeneous time is the domain of unbound serialities, whereas heterogeneous time, he says, is that of bound serialities. Now, this time of government, this heterogeneous time, the space of governmentality, the bound serialities, or especially the historical and particular, is where popular politics makes its claims through those categories, through those classifications and the imaginations that they foster. And in that sense, that is what enables, politics to be democratic. So he writes, if we don't see it that way, then he says it is morally illegitimate to hold the universalist ideals of nationalism without simultaneously demanding that the politics spawned by governmentality be recognized as an equally legitimate part of the real time space of modern political life of the nation. Without it, governmental technologies will continue to proliferate and serve, much as they did in the colonial era, as manipulable instruments of class rule in a global capitalist order. So, seen in this way, the modern form of the nation is both universal and particular. So, he then, in the context of Western Europe, but also elsewhere, he talks about how in this framework, how does one then make this framework of rights possible? This framework of rights is possible by the state by introducing concepts of freedom and equality. Now, freedom and equality both can have opposing tendencies, right? One can be free to do what they want to do, but that might impose upon everybody being treated equal. So this contradiction, he says, is resolved by introducing two more concepts, that of property and community. Property, because property becomes the lever, property resolves this contradiction where you are still free, you are still free to purchase property, you are free to own property, how much property, and yet not everyone is able to do so. So it proclaims freedom but justifies inequality while also arguing for equality, because everyone is free to own property. On the other hand, community creates this idea that we are all one, we are all a community, even if we are unequal, we believe in the same ideals. So this is how largely in the modern form of the nation, both universality and particularity unfold through these various conceptualizations of property and community. This is how it unfolded in a more abstract sense in Western Europe, although there are several particularities associated with it, and he articulates some of those. But he questions, to have modern and free political communities, one must have citizens, not subjects. He then comes to introduce another category, this also from Michel Foucault, that of population, that which is governed, that which is the object of the tools or the techniques of governmentality. He says citizen is the domain of theory. It is the domain of, the idea of rights-bearing citizen, of that who will, in the republic, engage in deliberations, be part of the formation of institutions. This is a theoretical idea. Not every citizen is able to do that. Population, he says, is the domain of policy. It is through these enumerations, classifications, categorizations that the state then engages with its task of welfare, of protecting its citizens through policies targeted towards specific populations. Now, in the Western world, he says, the way the idea of the nation state has moved, it has gone from the notion of citizen as that who is integral to deliberative democracy to the idea of population that needs to be governed. In the colonized world, he said, the population idea, that the population that is governed and through that imagines itself, preceded the becoming a citizen, becoming sovereign. Then he writes, the classical idea of popular sovereignty expressed in the legal political facts of equal citizenship produced the homogeneous construct of the nation, whereas the activities of governmentality required multiple cross-cutting and shifting classifications of populations as targets of multiple policies, producing necessarily the heterogeneous construct of the social. So he very clearly demarcates the universalist idea as belonging to homogeneous time space, but critiquing that idea as largely theory. In the real world, in practice, in popular democratic politics, it is the heterogeneous construct of the social that is conceptualized as population. Now, this creates a fundamental tension between ideas of modernity, where people are rights-bearing citizens, and the idea of popular sovereignty in modernity, to that of democracy, where democracy is working through largely governmentality and techniques of government. So, he writes, most of the inhabitants of India are only tenuously and even ambiguously and contextually rights-bearing citizens in the sense imagined by the Constitution. Well, how many people, usually even read the Constitution or know what is in the Constitution or argue on the basis of their constitutional rights? Oftentimes, he shows negotiations happen in the domain that is not necessarily such a clear-cut rights-bearing perspective. In fact, it might even be breaking or stretching our understanding of what constitutional law or law is. Civil society as an ideal continues to energize an interventionalist political project, but as an actually existing form, he says it is demographically limited. Civil society, he says, is the domain of the bourgeois, it is the domain of the elite. It is the domain that thinks of itself as central to institutional formation, as rights-bearing citizens that can negotiate with the state based on their fundamental rights and can deliberate on matters of democratic decision-making and so on. But this is a very, very small population. Organized elite domain and unorganized subaltern domain. So he says that there are two domains and they operate differently. Their engagement with the state is very, very different. And therefore, the ways in which they do politics is different. In fact, if you only look at the domain of civil society, then the work that happens and the politics that takes place in political society becomes invisible to you. And then you cannot see the functionings of democratic politics. Democratic politics in India appears to be a constantly shifting compromise between the normative values of modernity and the moral assertion of popular demands. So, he gives many examples, and I show one in the next slide, where claims on the state are made not on the basis of rights or law, but through a moral assertion, sometimes of community, sometimes of livelihood, or habitation. I mean, that in order to exist, we need this. And because you are a state, because you are responsible or you gain legitimacy through providing our welfare, for our welfare and for our protection, therefore, you need to fulfill these demands. In resisting the modernizing project imposed on them, the subaltern classes also embark on a path of internal transformation. So they too are sometimes incorporating the language of civil society, sometimes using moral assertions, sometimes using other popular ideas or forms that we might not recognize as politics, such as religious festivals or cultural norms and festivals in order to make claims. He says, in order to understand this politics, he introduces the term political society. He says, political society is the domain between civil society and the state. It operates outside formal politics. It operates outside the normative understanding of that, I have a certain right as a citizen and that I will appeal to the state based on my right, or that I am the popular, popular sovereignty exists because of me and therefore the state has to fulfill the rights. Now, by looking at popular politics, the idea of popular politics, he is widening the arena of political mobilization, which he defines as the proliferation of forms of mobilization by underprivileged communities that stretch law, that bend law, and rework the civic norms of good citizenship. He gives several examples. In fact, he gives examples of the clearance of a slum along a railway line in the 1940s, and the arguments and negotiations that follow, and how association is formed, led by a mediator, a school teacher in this particular case that he is talking about, and how this mediation unfolds based on certain moral assertions by the association. That association is not a legal entity, because most of the people in that slum are squatting on land that they do not own, and therefore there is no legal right that they can take recourse to. And when you cannot take recourse to legal rights, but in order to exist you need to have habitation, what does the large amount of population that exists in that category do then? Well, it takes recourse to political society, to forms of mobilization that are outside the law, that are outside this straight-jacketed understanding of the citizen and the state. And he says here, he's already spoken about the idea that governmental techniques predate the nation state in post-colonial societies, and therefore have enabled certain imaginations to take shape, and these imaginations then play a role in how claims are articulated by the political society. Classificatory criteria used by colonial government continue to shape forms of both political demands and developmental policy. So they are acting in civil society and political society. Government agencies must engage with political society in order to renew their legitimacy as providers of welfare and protectors of population. And they also engage in many different forms of politics that doesn't necessarily, it won't be easy to recognize them as formal politics. I mean, in South Indian politics, cinema going fans or fans of a particular star form an association. In another place, cricket players form an association, or it could be an association based on caste or religious affiliations. These may not very neatly fit into democratic liberal understanding of the republic or of politics, but these are not disassociated from the state. The politics of the governs gives empirical form of a population group the moral attributes of a community. And this was another critique that he had of the social theories that emerged out of the European context, as in this quest to transcend tradition community, in this quest to situate tradition and modernity as binary and as opposites in a linear time, they kind of undid the conception of community, which in fact is essential to the way that politics operates or is practiced in most of the world as popular politics and through political society. Now, these ideas of Partha Chatterjee have been discussed and critiqued and used quite a bit by several scholars. Some of the critiques range from a very stark distinction between civil and political society and questions on what it contributes to our understanding of the nation, but also of the strong association of political society with subaltern groups. So questions are asked about what happens when it is the elite that in fact bend and stretch laws in the way they engage with politics. So we'll continue the discussion, we'll continue these debates as we move on in our lectures. For today, thank you.